She doesn't belong here. Escort her off, now." That was all it took. One sentence. One brutal command from a flight attendant in front of a full first-class cabin, delivered to a young black woman whose only offense was sitting in the seat she had rightfully paid for. No mistake in the manifest. No breach of protocol. Just skin tone and silence used against her like a weapon. Her suitcase was still at her feet. Her boarding pass, valid, verified, trembled in her hand. And yet not a single person stood up. Not when she was accused of sneaking in. Not when she was forced to sign a document voluntarily, surrendering her seat. Not even when she was marched down the aisle like a criminal. But the story didn't end there. Because what no one on that plane knew, what made this moment explode into something no one could undo, was who they had just humiliated, and how far the consequences would reach once the truth surfaced. Where in the world are you watching from? What would you have done if you were on that flight? Would you have stayed silent or spoken up? Let us know in the comments. Like this video if it made you feel something. Subscribe if you believe stories like this need to be told. And remember, some flights don't just take off, they expose everything. Ariana Blake stepped onto the tarmac with the kind of stillness that didn't ask for attention, but always received it. At 17, she carried herself with an unshakable calm, cultivated by years of understanding that who you were on the outside was often all people saw. She wore a simple charcoal hoodie, clean white sneakers, and dark-fitted jeans. No logos, no jewelry, just quiet presence. Her hair was neatly braided and pulled into a low bun, revealing sharp eyes and a poised expression that gave nothing away. She walked steadily toward the glistening, obsidian-hulled private jet waiting at the edge of the runway, where staff in blazers and epaulets stood in tidy lines. To most eyes, this scene was routine, another high-net-worth traveler boarding a luxury aircraft. But not to Victoria. Victoria Hart had been the head attendant for high-tier operations at ArcLight Aviation for nearly 8 years. Known among her colleagues for her razor-sharp standards and strict adherence to brand presence, she prided herself on reading people in a glance. She could tell who was old money, who was trying too hard, and who simply didn't belong. And when she saw Ariana walking toward the steps of the $300 million jet, a craft typically reserved for corporate royalty and foreign dignitaries, her jaw tensed before she even realized it. Something about the girl struck her as wrong. Not her manner, not her calmness, but the dissonance. A teenager unaccompanied, not in designer attire, striding toward one of the most expensive aircrafts in the fleet, as if she owned the runway. The steps to the jet were polished aluminum, each one reflecting the sky and the movement of those who ascended them. Ariana climbed without hesitation, one hand lightly touching the rail. When she reached the top, Victoria was there, blocking the doorway. Her smile was professional, but her tone was colder than the jet's internal cooling system. "Excuse me," she said, voice firm and loud enough for the nearby crew to hear. "I think you're lost. This isn't the regional terminal." Ariana blinked once, calmly. "I'm not lost," she replied, her voice even. "This is Flight 14X to Geneva, correct?" Victoria's lips pressed into a thinner line. "This is a corporate-class international flight. We don't allow mistaken boardings. You'll need to step aside while we sort this out." Ariana reached into her backpack slowly and retrieved a slim black leather boarding envelope. She held it out without comment. Victoria didn't take it. She stared instead at the girl's face, at her hand, then back at her hoodie, like it told a story she didn't trust. "Who gave this to you?" she asked. "It was delivered to me yesterday," Ariana said, "by personal courier, as per the family's travel protocol." Victoria finally snatched the envelope, flipping it open. Her eyes scanned the contents. Everything was in order. Seat 1A, Ultra Executive Class, Passport ID, Digital Code Clearance. And yet, she hesitated. Behind Ariana, a pair of suited men were boarding. One of them, a senior VP with Frost Capital, looked over curiously. Ariana stepped slightly aside, allowing them to pass. But Victoria didn't move. Her tone dropped a level. "I need you to wait here. You'll be escorted to the correct flight shortly." Ariana's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. "This is the correct flight," she said. "This is my family's jet." Victoria stiffened. "And I'm the Queen of England," she snapped. "Step aside." Her voice had changed now. The politeness cracked. Authority was leaking into arrogance. The attending co-pilot, who had been reviewing pre-flight checks nearby, looked up, confused. Ariana did not move. Not until a uniformed guard approached, silently, and gestured her down the steps. She turned wordlessly and descended, each step slower than the last, not from fear, but from the gravity of recognition. She knew what had just happened. She'd lived it before, in quieter moments, smaller insults. But never this loud, never this public. Victoria remained at the top of the stairs, watching her go, one hand still clutching the boarding envelope as if it were counterfeit. The other attendants looked away, pretending to check tablets or adjust uniforms. The pilot said nothing. The VP, who had passed earlier, leaned to his assistant and murmured, "Didn't know they were letting interns on these flights now." His assistant smirked. On the tarmac, Ariana stood motionless for a moment, then turned to face the plane again. She didn't cry. She didn't storm off. She simply pulled out her phone and tapped a single message. "They said I didn't belong. Boarding denied. She's blocking the door." Inside the aircraft, Victoria handed the boarding envelope to Chloe, the junior attendant, and said quietly, "Check this with dispatch. This is a mistake." Chloe took it without comment, but her glance at the name tag on the ticket made her pause for a split second. Blake. The name rang familiar, but she said nothing. Upstairs in a glass-walled office, overlooking the private runway, a phone buzzed. A man in a tailored charcoal suit looked up from his monitor, eyes narrowing. He read the message, then stood slowly, placing a call that would not only change the course of the flight, but the careers of everyone on board. Ariana stood at the base of the stairs, still as the shadows cast by the jet's towering wing. The tarmac buzzed with mechanical rhythm, carts zipping by, ground crew waving signals. But within her, there was only the cold pressure of silence, the weight of 100 stares that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Moments earlier, she tried to board with dignity. Now she was left standing as if she'd just trespassed on sacred ground. But dignity doesn't vanish in the face of arrogance, it hardens. And as she looked up at the figure still blocking the entrance, Ariana's breath came steady, slow. She knew exactly what this was. Victoria remained on the top step, her stance rigid, one hand on her hip and the other holding the crumpled boarding envelope like it had confirmed her suspicions. Her voice, sharp enough to cut through jet engines, rang out across the tarmac. "Security to Gate 7. We have an unauthorized boarding attempt. Immediate removal requested." There was no hesitation in her words. She wanted everyone to hear. Every nearby passenger, every flight technician, every maintenance engineer. The show was on, and Ariana had unwillingly become its centerpiece. Inside the cabin, a ripple of curiosity turned to attention. Heads lifted. A man in a deep burgundy suit put down his champagne flute and leaned toward the aisle. A couple paused mid-conversation, eyes tracking the sound. The co-pilot stepped halfway out of the cockpit, brows knit in confusion. "Is there a situation, Miss Hart?" he asked cautiously. Victoria didn't turn. "Handled," she clipped back. Her focus still locked on the teenager below. Two security staff appeared within moments, dressed in gray and black, with radios clipped to their shoulders. They moved quickly, but not urgently. Routine, maybe, but visible enough to draw every eye. Ariana didn't flinch. As they approached, she quietly reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her identification again, this time along with the personal access letter sealed with the Blake Aviation insignia. "Here," she said, her voice calm, direct, without plea. "I've done nothing wrong." One of the guards took the documents and began to read, frowning slightly. The other looked to Victoria for instruction. "We were told she wasn't authorized to board," he said hesitantly, "that she was on the wrong aircraft." Victoria crossed her arms. "I said she wasn't authorized because I know who boards this flight. I've worked it for 6 years. That face isn't one of them." Her eyes never left Ariana's. Ariana looked up then, gaze level. "You didn't check a system. You didn't call dispatch. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong." There was no tremor in her tone, only clarity. That made it worse for Victoria, whose cheeks flushed faintly, not with embarrassment, but with control slipping from her grip. She stepped down one stair, standing taller, making sure her voice echoed clearly for the watching crowd. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said, teeth tight behind her words. "But if you must know, it's because you don't belong here. This is a premium space. Our clients expect a certain standard. I'm maintaining it." The words hung in the air like spilled fuel, heavy and unmistakable. The man in burgundy raised an eyebrow. Another passenger whispered, "Did she really say that out loud?" Someone in the rear cabin shifted in their seat, clearly uncomfortable. But still, no one spoke up. The security guard holding Ariana's documents looked unsure now, his eyes flicking between the letter and the boarding manifest on his tablet. "This ID checks out," he said under his breath. "Everything matches." But Victoria cut him off before he could continue. "Escort her off," she said sharply. "She can sort out the paperwork elsewhere. This flight is already behind." Ariana stared at her for a moment longer. Not with hate, not even resentment. Just that same steady calm that unnerved people who thrived on reaction. She handed the guard her small carry-on, then followed him a few steps toward the waiting exit gate. But as she turned, her voice, soft but piercing, reached back to Victoria. "The thing about doors," she said, "is you never know which ones swing back harder." Victoria's spine straightened, but she didn't reply. From inside the cabin, a quiet tension simmered. Chloe, the junior attendant, stood stiff near the curtain, her tablet in hand, pretending to scroll through the manifest. She had heard everything. So had the co-pilot, now fully emerged from the cockpit, glancing toward the stairwell like he wanted to speak but had swallowed the impulse. Back near the luxury rows, a woman in white silk glanced away from her window seat, her brows furrowed. She wasn't causing trouble, she murmured to no one in particular. What was that about? Her partner shrugged. Company policy, probably. They're careful who they let near the private accounts. Victoria returned to her position, brushing imaginary dust off her blazer sleeve. She turned to Chloe. "Let's resume boarding. We're late." Chloe nodded, but her eyes lingered on the staircase, on the empty steps where Ariana had stood just moments before. She wanted to ask, was it really necessary? But she didn't. Instead, she tapped the next name on the check-in list, her throat dry. Meanwhile, Ariana sat just inside the glass terminal, her carry-on at her feet, and her phone still open on the last message she had sent. Her hands rested calmly on her knees. From outside, the jet loomed like a fortress, closed, silent, gleaming. But Ariana didn't look at it. She looked down at her wrist instead, where a small bracelet glinted softly in the morning sun. A family crest etched in platinum, the symbol of a name not easily erased. She knew what would come next, not because she expected vengeance, but because justice, when planted in silence, grows louder than any scream. The glass door of the private terminal shut with a hiss behind Ariana, but she didn't flinch. She sat with her back straight, her eyes locked on the tarmac where the jet still waited, engines humming in idle patience. Inside her chest, nothing boiled. She had trained herself too well for that. Anger was a luxury she rarely indulged in. Calm was her armor. One of the guards stood nearby, shifting uncomfortably as he double-checked her documents for the third time. He didn't speak, but his frown deepened the longer he read. The embossed seal on the letter, the passenger code, the flight manifest, it all matched. It had matched from the beginning. But none of it had mattered because the moment she was seen, she had already been judged. Inside the aircraft, Victoria stood near the front galley, breathing a little faster than she wanted anyone to notice. The confrontation had played out publicly, messier than she preferred, but ultimately under her control. She believed she had asserted the brand standard she swore by: exclusivity, image, predictability. But something about the way the girl had looked at her before walking away still echoed in her mind. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't defeat either. It was worse. It was a silence that had weight. She turned to Chloe, who hovered nearby, pretending to reset the cutlery trays. "I want that bag checked," Victoria said quietly. Her tone clipped. Chloe hesitated. "She's already been escorted off," she replied. She took it with her. Victoria gave her a look that spoke volumes. "Not that one. The other piece. The assistant brought it earlier, said it was hers. Still in cargo hold. Get it up here." Chloe nodded slowly and stepped away. Minutes later, Ariana's second carry-on, a sleek, matte black leather case with silver clasps, was brought up from storage and placed near the front of the aircraft. Victoria unlatched the buckles herself. She didn't bother asking for permission, didn't notify ground staff, didn't log it. She opened the bag like she expected something scandalous to spill out, fraudulent IDs, perhaps, or a last-minute printout of a stolen reservation. But what she found were labeled compartments, a precisely folded blazer, a worn hardcover journal with initials embossed in gold, and a stack of official travel documents in a neatly zipped pouch. Everything was organized to a degree that unsettled her. She searched further, flipping through the pages, holding items up like she might find a hidden deception. Then, at the bottom, she found a slim, black wallet. Inside, 2 cards with the Blake insignia, one for private banking, the other for company access. She narrowed her eyes, unsure what she was hoping to find now that everything had disproved her theory. Just then, Chloe returned and hovered nearby. "Nothing suspicious?" she asked carefully. Victoria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled the banking card out and held it between her fingers like evidence. "I want her to verify this was her purchase," she said, tone low but unmistakably harsh. "I don't care if it has her name on it. People borrow names. They rent seats. I want confirmation." Chloe blinked. "You mean you want her to explain how she paid for her seat?" Victoria looked up, her expression unreadable, but laced with something colder than policy. "Yes. If she wants to claim she belongs here, she'll prove it. On record." Chloe didn't know what to say. She hesitated, then muttered under her breath, "You handled that perfectly. Some people really need to be reminded of their place." Victoria heard it and gave a small, approving nod, as if reassurance made the decision more professional. But Chloe's words lingered in the air longer than either of them realized. Meanwhile, the co-pilot finally stepped away from the cockpit and approached, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" he asked. "Why are we going through passenger luggage?" Victoria turned toward him, smooth as glass. "Security protocol. There was an irregularity. We're clearing it before takeoff." He frowned deeper. "I didn't get any notice. Ground ops hasn't logged anything either." "It's handled," Victoria said firmly, her eyes challenging him to question her further. He didn't. He nodded slowly, then turned away, but the tension in his shoulders said enough. Back in the terminal, Ariana sat with her phone still unlocked. She hadn't received any follow-up messages yet, but she didn't need to. She knew how this sort of thing played out. Delay, discredit, deflect. Her fingers traced the edge of the leather strap on her carry-on, the one still on the plane. She imagined the zipper being pulled, her belongings turned over like a crime scene. Not for safety, but for satisfaction. She could picture Victoria's face, the eagerness to confirm something that fit the narrative she'd already written. The narrative Ariana had been fighting her whole life. Her phone buzzed. It was a one-line message from the operations chief at Blake Global. "Do not leave the terminal. We're on our way." She locked the screen without responding. She had no plans of going anywhere. On board, Chloe placed the black wallet back into the bag, zipped it shut, and set it aside, though her hands lingered. There was a part of her that had started to squirm under the surface, a whisper that this might have gone too far, but the fear of Victoria's disapproval still loomed larger than any discomfort. Victoria crossed the cabin toward the service panel, typing something into the manifest override system. Her fingers moved fast, assertive, deleting Ariana's name from the passenger list and replacing it with a blank entry labeled vacant, unauthorized. She clicked save. A beep confirmed the change. She stood up, adjusted her blazer, and smoothed the crease on her skirt. Control had been restored. But even as she stood tall in her victory, something beneath her skin itched with unease. Maybe it was the stillness outside the window, or the quiet shift in Chloe's eyes, or the co-pilot's silence growing heavier by the minute. She couldn't say. She only knew she needed the jet in the air. Soon, before questions started forming into words. The interior of the aircraft was unusually quiet now, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of a flight ready to ascend. It was a kind of silence thick with assumption, where judgment whispered more loudly than words. Passengers shifted subtly in their seats, some pretending to read, others watching Victoria through careful side glances as she returned from the galley, hands poised, composure flawless. Chloe walked behind her slightly slower, clutching a small tablet in one hand as if clinging to something to focus on, but her eyes flicked up to meet Victoria's and then quickly dropped. No one said it aloud, but the tension had crept its way into the cabin like a breeze from an unseen crack, and even those who hadn't witnessed the scene directly could sense that something had happened. Something important, something unsettling. Near the third row of executive class, a man in a pale blue blazer leaned toward the woman beside him. He was in his mid-50s, a seasoned consultant type, the kind of man who talked about golf handicaps and IPOs over espresso. His voice was low, but not soft enough. "She must have sneaked in," he muttered. "No way a kid like that pays for this kind of seat. I've seen it before. Happens more than you'd think." The woman raised a brow, but said nothing, merely returning her gaze to the window, as if silence was safer than dissent. He didn't notice the slight stiffening of her posture, or the way her fingers tightened around the armrest. Across the aisle, another woman, early 40s, dressed in a beige power suit, adjusted the hem of her skirt and exchanged a look with her colleague, one that said everything without saying a word. Confirmation, not curiosity. In the galley, Victoria finished typing something into the manifest console and turned to Chloe. "Bring her the waiver," she said. "Tell her if she signs, she avoids an incident report. It's a formality at this point." Chloe hesitated, then nodded and retrieved a slim leather folder from the overhead compartment. She glanced down at the document as she walked, passenger withdrawal acknowledgement form. It was standard in cases of disruptive behavior, threats to safety, or administrative error. But none of those applied. Still, the signature line waited at the bottom, empty but expectant. Ariana sat in the waiting lounge inside the private terminal now, not detained, not restricted, just surrounded by the kind of cold formality that didn't need handcuffs to feel like punishment. Her hands rested on her lap, her back straight, the calm still undisturbed in her expression. She had not cried. She had not demanded justice. She had simply waited. Chloe approached slowly, her footsteps soft against the tile, and held out the folder. "We need your signature," she said, avoiding direct eye contact. "It's to confirm you've voluntarily withdrawn from the flight." Ariana looked at the form, then up at Chloe. Her gaze wasn't hostile, but it was piercing, steady, and unflinching. "Is this the part where I admit to something I didn't do?" she asked. Chloe swallowed, her throat tight. "It's standard," she replied. "For record purposes. It'll make things smoother." Ariana opened the folder and read the document top to bottom, then reached for the pen offered. She didn't pause to weigh her options. She didn't protest. She signed with a single motion, elegant, efficient. But when she handed it back, her eyes lingered on Chloe's. "Smoother for who?" she asked. Chloe didn't answer. Back on the plane, Victoria reviewed the updated manifest and nodded in satisfaction. "Let the tower know we're ready," she told the co-pilot. He didn't respond right away, just stared out the window for a moment. Then, as if shaking off a thought, he reached for the radio. A few rows back, the man in the pale blazer leaned back in his seat and sighed with contentment, muttering, "Back on schedule." No one responded. No one needed to. The message was clear. The air had shifted, balance restored, not truthfully, but publicly. Outside, Ariana stood near the terminal window, watching the aircraft as its engines began to spin again. A ground crew member approached with her second bag, the one that had been opened, checked, and zipped back without apology. He set it down gently and stepped away. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Her fingers tightened tightened around the handle. A nearby gate agent approached, holding a small electronic device. "Miss Blake," she said, her tone rehearsed professional. "Your signature confirms your withdrawal. We'll arrange a rebooking shortly. Is there anything else you require in the meantime?" Ariana didn't look at her. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I think everything I need to see has already been shown." The agent blinked, unsure how to respond, then nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, as the jet pulled slowly away from the gate, a young man in seat 2C, who hadn't spoken a word until now, glanced at the seat where Ariana was supposed to be. He'd seen her earlier, seen the way she carried herself, seen the way she stood her ground. His brows were furrowed now, his foot tapping slowly against the floor. Across from him, the woman in the beige suit whispered, "What a waste of time," but her voice lacked conviction, like even she wasn't sure anymore. Yet still, no one said it aloud. No one stood up. No one asked, "What if we were wrong?" As the aircraft taxied from the gate with its engines humming beneath polished wings, the energy within the cabin slowly began to thaw. Passengers reclined their seats slightly, loosened their collars, and returned to devices or half-read business briefs, pretending as if nothing significant had happened, as if the tension from moments ago hadn't passed through the aisles like a silent storm. But the echo of what they witnessed or ignored lingered in quiet corners of their minds. Somewhere beneath the noise of scheduled convenience, the truth still pulsed like a warning light ignored. In the galley section tucked behind the first-class curtain, Victoria Hart poured herself a glass of imported white wine with practiced ease, letting the liquid swirl briefly in the tall crystal stem before taking a slow, satisfied sip. She sat down in the staff jump seat with one leg crossed, her posture relaxed, her expression composed with just the hint of a victorious smirk tugging at one corner of her mouth. Chloe lingered nearby, sorting silverware, but kept glancing at Victoria like she was waiting for the cue to speak. Victoria held the glass to her lips again and said under her breath, "That girl was a liar." Easy to spot from a mile away. The tone was not defensive, it was confident, as though she'd passed a test only she understood the rules of. "Entitled kids these days," she continued. "Think a pair of clean sneakers and a fake ticket makes them royalty." Chloe looked up then, emboldened by Victoria's satisfaction. She stepped closer, leaned slightly in, and said, "You want me to flag her for the internal no-fly list?" Her voice was quiet but eager. "I can file her under passenger misrepresentation. That way she'll never fly our fleet again. Not even economy." Victoria gave a low, amused laugh, not cruel, but certainly pleased. "Now that," she said, "is initiative." Chloe smiled, small, sharp, complicit. She returned to the tablet clipped to the wall console and began tapping in commands. She didn't even flinch as she filled in the form, checked the box labeled behavioral risk, and typed Ariana's name into the restricted registry. It only took seconds. With a final tap, the confirmation screen blinked. Entry logged subject pending cross-fleet review. Chloe looked back at Victoria, who raised her glass slightly, a mock toast. "Cheers to clean flights," she said. Chloe chuckled and returned the gesture with her water bottle, bumping it lightly against the wine glass in a gesture more symbolic than celebratory. The hum of the engines outside created a soothing undercurrent as they began their slow climb toward cruising altitude, and within the galley, that hum masked the smugness settling between the two women like invisible perfume, palpable only to those standing close enough. "You know," Victoria mused, "I've seen her type before. Always walking like they own the room, like rules were made to be bent for them. I don't care whose name was on that badge, there's a way to belong, and she didn't have it." Chloe nodded, eager to agree. "It's the way they carry themselves. Like they're owed something. Like respect is automatic." "Exactly," Victoria said, snapping her fingers. "Like boarding the flight is their right, not a privilege." The door to the cockpit opened briefly, and the co-pilot stepped out, glancing toward them. He opened his mouth as if to ask something, then caught the look on Victoria's face and stopped. Instead, he said, "Cabin secure?" "Of course," Victoria replied smoothly, her smile quick and unbothered. The co-pilot gave a short nod and returned to the cockpit. Once the door closed, Chloe exhaled with a slight laugh. He looked like he was going to ask about her. Victoria waved it off. He knows better. They all do. This is my cabin. I set the tone. No exceptions. As they spoke, the rest of the flight settled into its quiet rhythm. A passenger requested sparkling water. Another inquired about the dinner options. Victoria answered with the same charm she always delivered, smooth and pleasant, as if the earlier incident had been nothing more than a smudge easily wiped clean from the window of luxury. But underneath the calm, a different kind of stain had been set. One made not of spilled wine or misfiled paperwork, but of pride unchecked, of judgment mistaken for instinct, and of prejudice draped in the uniform of procedure. Chloe returned to her seat for a moment, still watching Victoria with admiration. "You really know how to hold a line," she said. "Most people would have second-guessed it after the ID matched." Victoria tilted her head. "Second-guessing is for amateurs," she replied. "If you hesitate, you lose control. And in this job, control is everything." She finished her wine in one slow motion and set the glass down with a faint clink. Her confidence radiated not from policy, but from years of unchallenged authority. A system that had taught her to trust her instinct even when it was wrong, to believe that appearances were the first and final truth. But miles away, in a tower lined with glass and steel, the man whose name had been printed on Ariana's boarding pass was already walking down a corridor with his phone to his ear, speaking only 4 words to the person on the other end. "Put me through to operations." Behind him, the doors of a high-level boardroom clicked shut, and silence reclaimed the corridor, just as a shift in altitude gently rocked the plane carrying 2 women who believed the storm had passed. Neither of them looked at the empty seat in 1A. Neither of them questioned the decision anymore. In their minds, the matter was closed, sealed, deleted. As the jet ascended steadily through a curtain of late morning clouds, the passengers who filled the luxurious cabin sank deeper into leather seats and distractions of choice, magazines, tablets, in-flight cocktails. Yet underneath the polished decorum and ambient hum, an unease still simmered, like static beneath a polished surface. The seat that should have belonged to Ariana, 1A, remained empty, a quiet monument to something no one quite dared to name. Most ignored it altogether. Others let their gaze drift over it quickly before snapping back to their devices. But the absence was too loud to fully forget. Victoria and Chloe had returned to routine, or at least a performance of it. Meals were being prepped. Drinks were offered. Smiles, although thinner than usual, were still part of the service mask. But within the private cocoon of cabin class, where influence and money usually silence conscience, the truth had begun to gnaw gently at the corners of perception. In row 3, a man in his early 60s adjusted his cufflinks and avoided every reflective surface that might show him his own expression. His name was Leonard Bishop, a finance consultant known for aggressive acquisition deals and a preference for not getting entangled in things outside his balance sheets. Yet when Ariana had looked to him, just moments before being led away, with eyes that didn't plead, but simply asked why, he had looked down. Not out of guilt, not at first, out of instinct. That same reflex that told him not to comment, not to interfere. He had gripped his seat arms slightly tighter and told himself this wasn't his business. That he didn't know the whole story. That maybe there was something she wasn't telling them. But the story had been clear, too clear. And now the air felt heavier. Across the aisle, a woman in a crisp white pantsuit sat beside her husband, lips pressed into a tight line. She had watched the entire scene unfold, had heard the tone in Victoria's voice shift from professional to patronizing, had seen the girl's steady composure. She had noticed the details, the matching boarding envelope, the branded pass, the documents that matched. She had seen enough. But when she opened her mouth, her husband touched her wrist under the tray table, subtle but firm. She looked at him and whispered, "We don't want to get involved." He nodded silently, her hands folded in her lap afterward, knuckles pale with tension. They both turned their attention to the seat-back screens in front of them, pretending to scan the entertainment menu. The cabin was filled with similar choices, tiny decisions made by each individual to remain neutral, to stay quiet, to not risk a confrontation, not with the airline, Not with the other passengers. Not with the truth. A younger couple in row 5 exchanged uncertain glances. The woman had started to rise when Ariana was confronted, only to be pulled gently back down by her partner. "Let it go," he'd murmured. "We don't know the situation." Now, she sat with her arms folded, her gaze fixed on nothing, her jaw clenched tight with what-ifs. Meanwhile, Chloe busied herself at the back of the galley, organizing trays that had already been sorted. Her movements were automatic, but her thoughts weren't. The image of Ariana's signature on the waiver, the look she'd given her, calm, piercing, undeniable, stayed with her. Chloe knew it wasn't about the boarding pass. It was about being seen and still disregarded. She wanted to shake the feeling, to believe the checklist had been followed. But a growing part of her knew that paperwork wasn't what determined right or wrong. Not really. Victoria passed by her without speaking, checking each row as if ensuring everything was under control. She paused near the front, offering a practiced smile to Mr. Bishop, who returned it with a mechanical nod. She offered water to the woman in white, who accepted it without eye contact. No one mentioned the seat still empty at the front. No one dared. A few rows back, a teenager traveling with his father leaned toward the window and whispered, "Dad, what happened to the girl?" His father adjusted his tie and replied quietly, "She wasn't on the list." The boy hesitated, then said, "But she had a ticket, didn't she?" The man's silence was answer enough. Somewhere in the sky, the jet passed over a silver stretch of ocean, the clouds scattering beneath like thin gauze. But inside, the atmosphere had congealed into something colder, stiffer. It wasn't anger. It was something more insidious, justification wrapped in politeness, ignorance masked as process, and indifference dressed up as etiquette. None of them had spoken. None of them had stood. Not when it mattered. At precisely 37 minutes past the hour, just as the jet banked gently into its initial cruising altitude, Captain Reese Ellison received a call on the encrypted cockpit line, one that bypassed all standard communication routes and lit up on his console with a code he had only seen used twice before in his entire career. The caller ID wasn't a number. It was a designation: Blake, Priority 1. Reese's hand paused for only half a second before pressing the button to accept. The cockpit door had just been locked. The co-pilot was reviewing the navigational systems. The sky was calm, but the captain's voice, always measured, dropped into a tone even quieter as he answered, "Captain Ellison speaking." On the other end, silence lingered for a second, just enough to stretch nerves, before a voice spoke, low-clipped and unmistakably powerful. "Did you just remove my daughter from my plane?" The words struck harder than turbulence. Reese straightened instinctively, his breath catching slightly, though he forced his tone to remain professional. "Sir," he began, "we had a situation at boarding." The passenger was, but the voice on the line didn't wait. "Her name is Ariana Celeste Blake. She was booked under Executive Clearance Protocol, Seat 1A. I want to know exactly who gave the order to deny her boarding." Reese's hand hovered over the control panel. "Our lead attendant made a judgment call." There was no judgment to make," the voice interrupted again, this time with steel behind it. "She was carrying documents directly issued by my office. If they were questioned, it means your crew ignored internal validation." Reese didn't deny it. He couldn't. The details were already clicking together in his mind. The delay, the incomplete manifest updates, the junior attendant's hesitation, the cold confidence on Victoria's face when she said it had been handled. The voice came again, sharp and clear. "You will stop that plane now. I've already contacted the terminal chief. Ground security is being rerouted to your location. No one leaves until she's back on board." By the time the line went dead, Captain Ellison was already toggling the alert beacon. He opened the cockpit door a second later, unusually abrupt. Chloe was just passing with a tray when she saw his face and stopped. "Captain," she asked, voice uncertain. He didn't answer her. Instead, he walked the length of the aisle directly to Victoria, who was arranging linens for the next course with an air of triumphant efficiency. "Ms. Hart," he said quietly but firmly, "we need to speak." "Now." Victoria turned, caught off guard by his tone. Is there a problem? Not yet, he said. But there will be if you don't follow me. She glanced at Chloe, confused, but followed him without further question into the forward galley, where the noise of the cabin dimmed. Less than 90 seconds later, the intercom buzzed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unexpected procedural check, we have been instructed to return to the gate for a brief hold. We apologize for the inconvenience and will update you shortly. Whispers rippled immediately through the cabin. The woman in the white suit looked at her husband with alarm. Mr. Bishop glanced around, clearly unsettled. Chloe stood frozen, tray still in her hands, her eyes flicking back and forth between the closed galley door and the rows of suddenly curious passengers. On the ground, near the security corridor of the private aviation wing, a convoy of 2 black SUVs and 1 security van pulled up to the back gate of the tarmac. At the front of the line stepped a tall man in an executive blazer, flanked by a woman holding a sealed folder and a uniformed airport security commander. All 3 moved with intention, cutting across the concrete with their coats rippling in the wind. When they reached the gate's control panel, the commander flashed a credential card, triggering the system override. The air traffic supervisor met them halfway down the jet bridge. "This isn't standard," he started to protest, but the commander simply said, "This isn't standard protocol. This is executive override. Step aside." Back inside the cabin, Victoria returned to her post, her face tighter now, though she tried to mask it. Chloe leaned toward her and whispered, "What's going on?" Victoria shook her head, but her eyes betrayed the smallest tremor of doubt. "It's nothing. Probably a routine inspection. We're still in control." But her words didn't match her expression. Passengers began turning in their seats. Conversations picked up. A sense of unrest pulsed faintly through the aisles. In row 2, the teenager who had asked about Ariana earlier whispered again, "Is she coming back?" His father didn't reply this time. He didn't know. Neither did anyone else. Then the front door of the aircraft opened with a soft mechanical hiss. The sound alone drew attention, head swiveling toward the source. In stepped the terminal chief, followed by the security commander, and behind them, in a tailored charcoal coat and composed posture, walked Ariana Blake. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like she belonged. And this time, no one questioned it. The moment Ariana Blake stepped back onto the aircraft, the very air seemed to shift. Not violently, not abruptly, but like a pressure drop before a storm. The kind of stillness that follows only after something deeply wrong begins to right itself. She walked with a composed stride, her charcoal coat falling just below the knees, her posture unshaken by what had transpired only an hour earlier. On either side of her flanked 2 figures. One, a sharply dressed woman from Blake Global Aviation's executive branch, holding a slim folder under one arm. The other, a uniformed security commander with a neutral expression and steel in his steps. The contrast between their presence and the stunned silence inside the cabin was stark. Ariana didn't glance sideways. She didn't make eye contact with the passengers, now watching her with 1,000 questions they dared not voice. Instead, she walked forward, straight down the aisle, each step echoing louder than the whispering wheels of the flight cart or the distant hum of the jet's idle thrust. Victoria, who stood frozen halfway between the galley and first class, instinctively stepped backward when she saw Ariana return. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her fingers, previously nimble and commanding, now hovered awkwardly near her clipboard, as if unsure of what to do without authority to wield. Chloe, 2 steps behind her, stared with wide eyes, clutching a silver water pitcher she no longer remembered picking up. The passengers, who had whispered theories earlier, now turned fully in their seats, some sitting taller, others leaning forward as if proximity might bring clarity. Mr. Bishop adjusted his tie twice in the span of 10 seconds. The woman in the white pantsuit inhaled slowly and held it, the skin around her eyes tight with sudden realization. Ariana stopped at the foot of seat 1A. The leather was untouched, the seat pristine, untaken, as if waiting only for her. She turned slightly, and the executive at her side stepped forward. Without raising her voice, she addressed the cabin with practiced precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are reinitiating the boarding protocol as directed by Blake Global Aviation Command. Passenger Ariana Blake is hereby reinstated to her assigned seat." Her words were calm, diplomatic, but their implication cracked through the air like a silent gavel. The security commander gave a single nod and stepped aside. Ariana placed her carry-on beside her feet, unbuttoned her coat, and sat down, not with triumph, not with defiance, but with quiet, unapologetic presence. Her eyes didn't seek out anyone's approval. She didn't need validation. She simply took her seat because it had always been hers. And that, more than any shouted declaration, unraveled the fiction that had been built around her moments before. Captain Reese Ellison exited the cockpit as she settled in. He adjusted his blazer, glanced at the faces before him, some ashamed, some curious, others stunned into a rare stillness. And then, for the first time in his 20-year career, addressed a cabin not with flight instructions, but with a reckoning. His voice, steady and unmistakably resolute, carried through the plane's pristine interior. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to clarify one matter before we continue this flight." He took a breath, just long enough to let silence settle. "Miss Ariana Blake is the principal shareholder of this fleet. She flies where she pleases. No further judgment required." There was no applause, no gasps, just the kind of silence that feels like the first seconds after a wave crashes, a moment of collective pause as everyone recalibrated their place in the story. A few eyes drifted toward Victoria. She stood rigid, the color slowly draining from her cheeks, her mouth barely closed. Chloe lowered the pitcher in her hand and took a half step back toward the galley, as though distance might dissolve complicity. The woman in the white pantsuit looked down at her lap, her fingers twitching nervously. Mr. Bishop rubbed the bridge of his nose and stared at the seatback screen without seeing it. And Ariana, serene in seat 1A, pulled out a book from her bag, flipped to the page she'd marked that morning, and resumed reading, her fingers steady, her eyes unmoved. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to prove anything. Every movement was louder than a response. Every breath reclaimed the space that had been denied to her. Somewhere mid-cabin, a passenger whispered to his wife. She didn't even say a word. The wife replied, voice barely audible. She didn't have to. A young attendant from economy, just stepping into the aisle for a routine pass, paused at the edge of first class. She caught Ariana's gaze for the briefest second. There was no smile exchanged, no nod, but something passed between them. A recognition, an acknowledgement, something honest. Victoria, still frozen in place, tried to speak. Her voice cracked. She reached for the intercom panel as if about to make an announcement, but the captain raised one hand. "No need," he said firmly. "Please return to your post, Ms. Hart." She lowered her hand slowly and turned, walking back to the galley in stiff, measured steps. Chloe followed her wordlessly, her mind reeling, her heart now thudding with a slow, undeniable dread. She thought about the list she had flagged, the report she had filed, the smirk she had shared. And now she thought about what Ariana's last glance had meant. It hadn't been a warning. It had been a mirror. The hum of the aircraft had returned to its usual rhythm, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly to indicate the cruise phase of the flight, but the atmosphere was far from relaxed. The silence remained, not from turbulence or exhaustion, but from the weight of what had just transpired. Ariana sat in 1A, calm, composed, still flipping the pages of her book, though no one could tell if she was actually reading. Passengers, who had once dismissed her, now dared only brief glances in her direction, unsure of how to reconcile the image they had crafted with the truth that had replaced it. In the galley, Victoria stood motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, as if bracing herself against invisible forces. Chloe hovered nearby, tablet clutched to her chest like a shield, her thoughts cycling endlessly between what she'd done, what she hadn't done, and what might come next. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The echo of the captain's voice, principal shareholder of this fleet, still lingered like a second heartbeat inside their heads. A quiet chime broke the stillness, followed by the voice of the captain through the intercom, not for the passengers, but for internal crew. "Ms. Hart and Ms. Rivers," he said, using their full names, his tone firm and stripped of its earlier calm. "You are to report immediately to the aft service cabin. You are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. A representative will meet you upon landing." That was it. No further explanation. No room for argument. Victoria's breath caught, her eyes blinking in disbelief, but the order had come directly from the cockpit, and disobedience wasn't an option. Chloe didn't move at first. It was Victoria who finally stepped back from the galley counter and turned, her posture stiff, but still holding onto fragments of pride. Without looking at anyone, without speaking to each other, they walked down the narrow aisle past first class, past curious stares, past Ariana's steady presence. Victoria didn't dare look at her. Chloe did, but only briefly, and what she saw in Ariana's eyes wasn't vengeance. It was clarity. The aft service cabin was small, windowless, and not meant for long stays. It was used for crew breaks or minor debriefs mid-flight, but today it became a holding space, a place of reckoning. Victoria sat first, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Chloe sat opposite, her legs crossed at the ankle, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the corner of her uniform blouse. The silence between them stretched, uncomfortable, layered. For the first few minutes, Victoria said nothing. Then finally she whispered, "This is a mistake." Chloe didn't respond. She couldn't. She wasn't sure anymore. She had replayed the look on Ariana's face so many times in her head that it had etched itself into memory. A look not of outrage, but of exhausted certainty, like she had seen this happen before, like she had expected it. 3 hours later, the plane began its descent. The announcement came through the intercom, mechanical and impersonal. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." But for Victoria and Chloe, there was no protocol to follow, no cabin to check, no belts to verify. They sat in the stillness of consequence, buckled into jump seats, forced to confront the aftermath of their actions, not in isolation, but side by side. As the landing gear deployed with a heavy thud beneath them, Chloe's foot tapped uncontrollably. Victoria sat rigid, her jaw clenched. The ground approached quickly, and with it, accountability. The plane touched down smoothly, tires chirping against the tarmac. Passengers exhaled softly, as if collectively releasing the breath they didn't know they had been holding. A few murmured about the unusual flight. Others packed quietly, but everyone waited, because something about the energy in the cabin told them the story wasn't finished. Not yet. As the aircraft taxied toward the private terminal, a black SUV waited at the bottom of the jet bridge, engine running. Standing beside it, immaculately dressed in a navy suit with a Blake insignia pinned to the lapel, was Malcolm Stroud, Chief Operating Officer of Blake Global Aviation. He didn't hold a clipboard. He didn't carry a briefcase. His hands were folded behind his back, his posture sharp as steel. As the main door opened and the air bridge sealed into place, the captain stepped into the aisle and signaled for all passengers to remain seated until the official party boarded. There were no protests. No one moved. Malcolm entered the cabin without a word. His gaze swept the aisle, not pausing on passengers, not acknowledging whispers. He walked with precision straight toward the aft section. When he reached the rear service cabin, he stopped at the threshold and looked inside. Chloe rose instinctively. Victoria remained seated, as if standing would imply guilt. Malcolm's eyes locked onto her with an expression that didn't need volume. "You didn't fail your job," he said evenly. "You failed your judgment." His words weren't loud, but they landed with surgical accuracy. Chloe looked down. Victoria's face remained frozen, but her throat moved as she swallowed hard. "You'll be escorted to internal debrief immediately," Malcolm continued, "pending full investigation and board review. Your access is revoked, effective now." Chloe stepped out first. Victoria followed, not meeting anyone's gaze. The door shut behind them with a quiet finality. The cabin remained still. Ariana, still in seat 1A, gently closed her book and looked out the window as the SUV pulled away. 2 days had passed since the flight. The inquiry was still ongoing, but most of the critical decisions had already been made. Victoria sat alone in a quiet room at Blake Aviation's headquarters, her uniform folded neatly beside her, the badge removed. The blinds were drawn halfway, allowing filtered morning light to seep into the sleek conference space designed not for confrontation, but for reflection. A soft knock broke the stillness. Victoria looked up, expecting another HR official, but when the door opened, it was Ariana. No entourage, no executive chaperone, just the girl she had once dismissed with a glance. Now standing in the doorway of the room she herself had once ruled over with invisible lines and unspoken rules. Ariana stepped inside slowly, her tone unreadable, but her presence calm, assured. She didn't sit down right away. She didn't speak. She just looked at Victoria, waiting. Victoria cleared her throat, the sound unexpectedly fragile. "I didn't expect you," she said. Ariana tilted her head slightly. "I didn't expect any of this," she replied. Victoria gave a short, humorless laugh, then looked down at her hands. "I thought I was protecting our standards, but I was only protecting my prejudice." Her voice cracked near the end, and she swallowed hard to push it down. Her eyes were rimmed red, but no tears fell, only the weight of recognition that had taken too long to arrive. Ariana finally sat across from her, not leaning back, not folding her arms, just still, listening. "It's not the first time," she said quietly. "Not for me. Probably not for others either. But it was the first time someone had to see it all the way through." Victoria looked up. "I should have known. I should have seen your name, and it shouldn't have taken that." Ariana shook her head slowly. "That's not the point. It's never about the name, or the money, or the rank. It's about what people assume when they look at someone who doesn't fit their picture of belonging, and what they allow themselves to do because of it." Victoria pressed her lips together, then said, "I kept telling myself I was just being cautious, just upholding brand integrity. But it wasn't that. I didn't question your paperwork. I questioned you." The room fell quiet for a moment. Ariana's voice came softer this time. "Then help change it." Victoria blinked. "What?" "Help change them," Ariana repeated. "The policies, the culture, the ways people are trained to see threat where there is none. We need people who've seen the wrong side of power and choose not to stay there." Victoria's shoulders dropped slightly, the armor she had worn so long beginning to melt. "You want me to stay?" Ariana met her eyes. "I want you to do better, and help others do better too. That's harder than walking away, but it matters more." Victoria leaned back for the first time, inhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The silence between them wasn't strained now. It was restorative. She nodded once, slowly, and said, "I don't know where to start." Ariana gave the smallest smile. "Then let's figure it out, together." Outside the room, the corridors of the headquarters continued with their usual business. Meetings scheduled, policies updated, new hires briefed. But something had shifted. The board had announced a new initiative, a full review of onboarding procedures, anti-bias training at all leadership levels, and a permanent advisory panel led by passengers and employees with lived experience. Ariana hadn't asked for it. She hadn't demanded it. She had simply told the truth and stayed when it mattered most. Victoria was reinstated not as lead attendant, but as part of the training division, responsible for rebuilding the very guidelines she had once used to exclude. Chloe, after a voluntary apology and review, accepted a mentorship role under a more diverse oversight team. She asked to start from the beginning, and she did. The next time Ariana boarded a flight, the same aircraft sat waiting, polished and humming with potential. This time, no one questioned her as she walked up the steps. A junior flight attendant greeted her with genuine warmth, and when Ariana took her seat in 1A, she looked out the window, not for assurance, but for peace. Behind her, a new crew moved through the aisles with practiced ease and quiet intention. No one whispered, no one stared, no one assumed, and if they did, they kept in check, because something had changed, and now they all knew it. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? What moment hit you the hardest? And what would you have done if you were there on that flight? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter.